Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're logging in from. Thanks for joining us today, just like you can your cloud PC or even your AVD VM. Today, we're joined with a very special crew. We have so many experts for our government offerings for both Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. So I'm really excited to host you all today. How about you go ahead and introduce yourselves? And John, maybe let's start with you.
Cool. Yeah, I am John Kelbley. I'm the Azure Advanced Migration Lead for public sector, and working with these various desktop technologies for, I don't know, 20 some years here at Microsoft. So glad to be here with you.
Perfect.
My name is Nyler Gaskins. I actually started 3 years ago on John Kelbley's team. Moved to Windows 365, and I support our state and local government customers here as a global black belt.
Hi, I'm Phil West. I'm a strategic director for modern work inside Microsoft Federal, and I'm leading the Windows 365 government offering across our enterprise and federal groups.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Roy Barton. I'm a security and cloud endpoint technical specialist supporting the federal civilian government, specializing in everything endpoint to include Windows 365.
Hey everybody, and I'm Steve Downs. I am the Azure Government, or the product manager for Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop in the government space. I've been doing virtual desktops in that area for 2 decades now. Essentially, my role is making sure that products deliver on what our government customers need. So I'm happy to be here.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks everyone. For anyone joining, again, please post in the chat whether you're joining us on Tech Community or on YouTube. Post below, that way we can go ahead and get to those questions. While we wait for those, I feel like the entire discussion, we could probably just have one question to launch the entire hour here. But, any first takes on, how do you steer in any specific direction when it comes to Windows 365 or AVD, or, Roy, John, Nyler, anything you're hearing specifically from customers? What are some initial thoughts here? Maybe let's start with Roy.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of our customers, since AVD's been around, longer than Windows 365, they're more familiar with it. They've been exposed to it a little bit more, and a lot of times when we're introducing Windows 365 as an option, they really enjoy the simplicity of it. They enjoy the fact that it's all managed via the Intune console, and they enjoy the fact that it's a relatively simple deployment process from their end. One of the questions they ask is, well, why and what the use case would be. And a lot of times I steer them to things like interns, folks that ebb and flow out of their enterprise as users. And then the other option there is just standard Office IT workstations, right? Folks that are just using like Outlook or Word or, web browser based applications, just, sort of low end stuff. But we have the ability to support all the way up to use cases such as developers.
And I love to take our customers on the kind of the journey of where Azure Virtual Desktop came into play, and then why a couple years after that we created the solution Windows 365. And it was from direct feedback that we were given, John and team, right, to the engineering and marketing teams about the specific costs that customers want for 1 year, multiple years ahead, as well as not needing to manage from an infrastructure perspective, networking, remote profiles, storage for monitoring, and things like that.
And then I guess when we think about AVD, Windows 365, obviously with Windows 365, it's a dedicated desktop for users. What have you all been seeing in terms of in the government space for AVD? Is it still a heavy usage of desktops, or is there also a good mix of remote apps?
Well, I haven't seen as many remote apps, but what we have seen in federal agencies in particular is a lot of interest in taking advantage of the multi-session windows within AVD. And a lot of that has to do with the economics associated with their security stacks. So, and I have a slide I show sometimes with a giant fish tank full of fish, right? And if we equate an individual virtual machine to a fish tank, right? If I've got a big fish tank, my security stack might be like the heater in that fish tank, right? I need a heater for every fish tank that I have. Like I need a security stack. So if I've got a big tank, I can put more fish in it, and I need fewer instances of my security stack. If I give everybody their own virtual machine, now I'm going to burn a core, let's say, on security tools that are on the federal side, sometimes pretty heavy. Maybe I'm doing a lot around log collection and dumping things into Splunk. By putting, say, and we see this pretty regularly, say 20 users on a 16-core virtual machine, I'm reducing the amount of management that I have from a log data collection or OS perspective, but I can give people that same perception of having their own VM. So we've seen those economies of scale for those pooled instances being very popular on the federal government side for AVD in particular. I'd say the one place where we've seen the remote app be popular is for alternative platform access. I've seen a lot of organizations use terminal emulation or something like MSTSC to get into Linux VMs using XRDP or using X Windows, using MOBA Xterm or something like that. And that's where remote app has been popular, I think, is some of those functioning as a VPN alternative in large part for some of those large deployments.
And I think from one of the scenarios, I think as we've been discussing here, you can see there's a huge spectrum of use cases, scenarios. And I think, Christian, one of the things you mentioned is where do we direct a customer? Really, to be honest with you, it's much more about learning really what the customer is looking to do. And I don't know of any situation where we would suggest it's an or discussion. In many cases, it's an and discussion. It's, hey, there are situations where because of employee turnover, as Roy was mentioning, shuffling in and out, it might be the quick and dirty management capabilities of Windows 365 that are nice for them, the assignment of licenses, the optimized images. Whereas in use cases that John was talking about, it's great to have AVD as an option. I think that's unique for Microsoft is we can give you both. We don't force you to one to the other. There are two different use cases. And there's two different pricing models. So again, we can optimize for what is the strength or what is the weakness of our customer in terms of developing the right kind of platform for this. And I think that's one of the things we try to do is to give as many choices as possible without confusing people. I think too many choices is kind of confusing, but giving them these options, I think they can weigh the pros and cons.
And when I'm talking to CIOs and directors of IT, right, there's specific attributes that will drive a use case to one solution or another. And it's clear as day for most customers when I go through the persona alignment. So some of the attributes, right, are from an admin perspective. What level of management do you want to have, or flexibility do you want to have? And from a procurement perspective, do you want, flexible pricing, or do you want a specific, one user, one price, per month pricing as well? And from an end user experience perspective, do you know that this end user is going to be performant on whatever they're carved out in a multi-session environment? If yes, then great. If no, then we might want to get them on a dedicated machine in Windows 365.
I would also just like to add, I think it's important to keep in mind we have Azure Virtual Desktop available in all of our Azure Gov, Azure, and Azure Gov Secret today. Azure Gov Top Secret is coming soon. So if you're working in the secure air gap spaces, Azure Virtual Desktop is definitely the solution to consider there.
That's right, because Windows 365, it's in the U.S. government, correct?
That's correct.
Government, GCC and GCCH. I forget what the actual full term is.
Yeah, GCC moderate, GCC high,
Yeah.
Government Community Cloud.
Yeah, or some customers may understand impact level 2 or impact level 4, so IL2 or IL4.
So many terms.
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
Oh my gosh. I think there was one last thing that John, I think you mentioned in terms of both John and Phil, you're talking about the two different services with the fish tank heater model. It's really interesting you mentioned that because I did work on Azure Virtual Desktop for even before Azure Virtual Desktop, because I was on the team for like 3.5 years. I always thought a multi-session is just the OS and like, okay, sharing the OS and the core processes. But I hadn't really thought about it in terms of all of the AV tools you're going to run. And as you know, as a civilian and non-government person, I can just imagine how many different security tools you are running on each machine to maintain compliance, maintain security in such a tight environment.
Yeah, and it makes a big difference when you start looking at not having to run all those security tools in an individual user's VM and be able to take that load and put it on a big VM and give people access to more compute. I had one federal customer I was working with. They're deploying on 32 core VMs, and a lot of what drove the economic decision there was they didn't need to pull as many Splunk logs, right? So they're looking at the cost of Splunk justifying their large AVD deployment, which is kind of funny because Splunk, I won't comment on it, but there's probably more efficacious ways to do your log collection in Azure, since the stuff's in Azure and we have all that in Azure.
All the other tools.
There's certain economies of scale you can get, and it's worth mentioning too that with Azure Virtual Desktop, you can do personal VMs just like you can with Windows 365, right? The AVD is a platform, right, and it lets you craft a very bespoke deployments if you want to, and Windows 365 is built on that. Where I see the differentiation between products very often comes down to the procurement model. Procurement organizations, particularly federal, they love a predictable cost per month. It drives some of the procurement people absolutely nutty when they say, "Oh, it's Azure. You're gonna use what it's like electricity. You're just gonna pay for what you use for it." Like, no, I'm in procurement. We've got to predict. We need to predict, and that's where Windows 365 really shines is as a procurement choice for AVD, and I think that's super valuable. And I'd say the other pivot that I've seen in organizations is around who's going to be managing the deployment, right? And when Roy said, yeah, it's Intune managed, that means a lot. If there's a desktop organization that's going to be deploying, like the use case you mentioned around interns, it's intern season right now. Everybody's trying to figure out whether they're going to have to go buy laptops for all these interns, and both AVD and Windows 365 are getting a lot of interest so that people don't have to buy GFEs and provision them and get them deployed and return them and get all that stuff cranking along. And the intern scenarios, one where AVD makes a lot of sense, but with interns, Windows 365 it's a nice way to kind of cut your teeth with Windows 365 because interns don't have an expectation of access, right? So the Windows 365 deployment, you don't necessarily need to deploy with any Azure. You put a VPN client in there, and now the intern has to VPN from a managed device. It's a perfect scenario where people can cut their teeth on Windows 365. On AVD, generally, the people who are managing that aren't the desktop teams. They're going to be infrastructure teams or VDI teams, and they're used to, and there's an expectation there's going to be network connectivity that's there anyway, and it's going to be in Azure. And so it's a different dynamic for who's going to be managing it, and the infrastructure teams. AVD is something that they want because they want to turn all those knobs. But if it's desktop, and like I said, for interns, perfect example, it's a great solution for Windows 365, and I think we're seeing a little more pivot that way.
I think those are all good points in terms of the who's managing it, and then also it's probably the price model. Let's pin that for now. We did get some questions in, and then hopefully there's also more questions, and we'll come back to those topics. The first question that came in is, can we set up SSO with an outside IDP? For example, IDP is .com, O365 tenant, Azure Infra is ExpressRoute in Gov, and AVD will be in Gov. So for the single sign-on that's currently in public preview in commercial, and that is also in public preview for Azure DJoin and Windows 365. From what I do know, I don't know the exact timelines on releasing it to the various government clouds. I know that we have different goals and expectations of releasing it to government within X many days for both Azure products and also within Windows 365. But I know that the protocol in general does work for the government Azure D tenants.
Well, I think their question's really around third-party IDPs, right? And,
Yeah.
and identity provider, like when people are using third-party solutions, and there's a lot of third-party IDPs that work with Azure Active Directory, right? And that's
So
the dependence,
John,
right?
just to clarify, IDP is identity provider. So who's hosting your identities?
Right.
Yeah.
And so if any of those are working with Azure AD, you're going to have the same authentication flow largely for AVD. That the challenge is going to be authenticating into the VM. And I think the other nuance. So a lot of that stuff just simply works if it's already integrated with Office 365. The other nuance here, though, is it looks like this is a GCC customer with Azure Government, and so the identity isn't native to the Azure Government Cloud. That particular scenario is interesting because Windows 365 fits that scenario exactly, because for GCC customers, Windows 365 VMs actually end up being deployed in Azure Government. So if you've got an express route in Azure Government already, Windows 365 is kind of a set it and forget it way to do that deployment. Alternatively, if you're going to do AVD for a GCC customer in Azure Government, because your identity isn't in proximity, you're going to have to do some mumbo jumbo to make that work as far as manually registering the VMs cross cloud and blah, blah, blah. You're going to need an Azure commitment in commercial to make that work. Maybe use an Erdio manager. For that particular scenario, I think Windows 365 is kind of the sweet spot in Gov. I don't know what you guys think.
But the main thing is that, right, both of these solutions use Azure Active Directory as their main identity. And as long as you can integrate with Azure Active Directory, you can integrate with these services.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I know that when we were doing public preview for the single sign-on, we worked with customers having different IDPs that were federated from Azure AD. We had other third-party IDPs. Don't need to name drop them. But so yes, as long as it's federated from Azure AD, and essentially that user logs in and gets their Azure AD token, that single sign-on works. So yeah, John, thanks for that comparison. I totally forgot that was a unique difference between the two products in terms of where that identity is going to be joined or where that VM's identity is going to be tied to.
Yeah,
so that's a great point. And then Roy, while we're on the topic, just for the folks at home, which do you have examples of which passwordless options we get to support with this new single sign-on protocol?
Yeah. So as an example, we've tested for our civilian federal customers, we've tested the use of YubiKeys because they're becoming more popular as a multi-factor type authentication. And then we also test, we have the NIST test cards. So we've tested all of those options as well. So when the SSO support hits, everything will be ready. We've already proved that it works through the RDP application, the Microsoft RDP application. It's just we're waiting on that single sign-on from the application or the web browser into the Windows 365 service.
And one thing I'll add there is we are currently, we support smart card, whether it's CAC or PIV today on the Windows client. We are working as quickly as possible to bring that to Mac OS coming soon, as well as Linux partners like iGel. And then from there, we're going to investigate supporting that on iOS devices like your iPhones and iPads.
Yeah, I mean, and single sign-on's already there. A lot of federal government agencies are using ADFS. And if you're using ADFS, you could deploy single sign-on with PIV and CAC already. Yeah. Using the Windows client, it works great. We've got many customers in the federal government using that.
So one thing I do want to call out, just to clear the air, is that Windows 365 is built on top of Azure Virtual Desktop. So what comes to AVD from, like identity perspective, because we both use Azure Active Directory, will come to Windows 365 as well.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And also one clarification, because Donna brings up a good point. When it does flow to Windows 365, in most cases, we often have to do like an onboarding for FedRAMP or whatever. So it's not as though just because it works in AVD, we somehow get a pass. Once it gets integrated into Windows 365, we still have to do onboarding as well. So it actually, in some sense, actually gets double accredited in that case.
It's like double secret probation. That's awesome.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for that. We have another question that came in. This one's from Twitter. we work with a lot of contractors. How easy is it to set up and terminate a Windows 365 or AVD instance at the start or end of a contract? Can I specify the duration at setup?
So I'll take the Windows 365 side. I'll leave the AVD probably for John. Right, AVD and Windows 365 both were created to take responsibility away from customers from the virtualization control plane perspective, right? Windows 365, as it came out a couple of years later, it took that a couple steps further as well, right? So the idea of Windows 365 is that it's easy to set up. And just like you're giving end users access to printers and network drives via security groups, you do the exact same thing with a Windows 365 Cloud PC. And in Intune, you add them to a security group, specify the size of the machine that they're gonna have and the operating system. And just with a customer 2 weeks ago, I've seen it go as fast as 20 minutes when you spin that machine up. Depending on your licensing model, at the end of the month or year, right, you can remove that license. And after 7 days of that license not being in your tenant, that virtual machine will get torn down from a Windows 365 perspective because we have built-in DR. So it's something you can upload and get rid of within a month.
And Nyler, I want to bolt onto that because when I demonstrate the ease of deployment to some our government customers, I also talk about the ability during their onboarding or hiring process to build a flow so they could use automation on the back end to add them to that security group that's just naturally a part of their hiring process. And then just like you said, when the contract's over, that same flow could remove that user from that security group. And their administrators have nothing to do other than just nothing.
Yeah, we actually have a customer doing that with AVD today. You send an email, just the user sends an email to an email address, and all the provisioning and checks that need to happen behind the scenes. And a few minutes later, they're assigned to their desktop, whether it's Windows 365 or AVD. It's as simple as that.
Well, and I'll say for AVD in particular, if you mentioned, or they mentioned something about vendor onboarding and de-onboarding. Deploying AVD into a resource group for a particular pool is a great way to do that. When the project's over, you blow away the resource group and everything's gone, right? And that's instantaneous. Either way, with Windows 365 or AVD, it's built on hopefully a license entitlement that the customer already has for Windows Enterprise, right? So that entitlement grants them the ability to either procure a Windows 365 subscription and apply it to a user, or merely turn on VMs for AVD in Azure and fire up those workloads with no additional license costs. You're just paying for the compute, storage, and networking. But again, and you can do it in 10 minutes with AVD, just like 20 minutes with Windows 365. It's just a matter of minutes difference, but it's simple to provision and deprovision. I know that there's some organizations that build out secure enclaves on a per project basis. And I like to think that they build them out of like flash paper so that when the project's over, they want it to be eliminated and have no record of that project ever having existed. Why they do that? I don't know. It's government work. But they can do that. And the provisioning can be automated and deprovisioning as well. It's super fast if you want it to be.
And also one other point, just to highlight some of the things we talked about. AVD is obviously an Azure service. So you're building upon an Azure service, which is a metered service, if you will. It depends on how much you're using, how long you're using it. Obviously I'll draw an analogy to a taxi cab. It's like, however long it takes you to get there, however route you have to go, how many ever people you've got, it's kind of a metered service. Windows 365, even though it's built on AVD, is actually built with a different procurement model, which is a seat based. So the situation is you would elect to say, okay, I need so many cores. I need so much memory. I'd like some storage space. I pick and choose from configs, kind of like a menu. And then I need 300 of those seats or whatever. And so I kind of have them in a cache ready to be deployed. It's just a difference in number one, the management style. How many can you fire up at once? How much do you want your Azure build to be versus how many have you already planned for in Windows 365 world? So just as a point of clarity, there is some planning there on the Windows 365 side. is that, okay, if you start needing more, it's a seat-based license, just like your Microsoft 365 is a seat-based license. AVD and Azure service, just like Azure VMs, Azure storage, everything is kind of a compute model. You run the meter depending upon the type of service you're running. So that would be the other thing to think about here is you're thinking about the contracting is how do you pre-plan for those ebbs and flows if you're thinking about Win 365. It's a little different than AVD.
Part of the pre-planning that I love, I said at the top of the call, I love to take customers through is persona alignment, right? Understanding not only the admin end user experience, but going into detail of the applications they need access to, where those applications live, whether they're SaaS-based or on-prem, peripherals that need to be accessed, special things like GPU, right? Those things will really dictate, right, whether you put them in a multi-session pool, single session pool in AVD, or go to Windows 365 persistent.
And that's sort of where, when I'm talking with customers and they're trying to decide between one or the other, that's where I point them sort of to both, right? Because there's going to definitely be different personas, and there's nothing saying that you can't increase your ROI by owning both. In other words, your deployment, the ease of deployment over with Windows 365 and that known predictable cost model, but you have these other personas that maybe need GPU or need remote app capabilities, right? So it's either, to me, it's either. It's not, I'm sorry, it's and. It's not either or, it's and. It's yeah, I murdered that one, didn't I? It's an and. It's always an and.
Yeah. I feel like the entire conversation is always an and, putting them in finding out what's best for the customer. And I think that actually kind of leads into the next question is this is from Jeremy on Tech Community. The Windows 365 Gov scenario where the desktops live in an Azure Gov subscription. If we are using custom images for the desktops, where are those images managed? Intune, or do they reside as a template in the Azure Gov subscription? Phil, do you have guys on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's start with a little bit of the basics. Windows 365 does come with a catalog of images. So you can say, hey, I want to get Windows 10, Windows 11. I want to get some pre-configured tuning done. So for example, I might want to be ready to go as an M365 user with Teams optimization, for example, for your audio, video, and so forth. So you can pick and choose some of that. If you have a custom image, so here there's a couple things that we often see. Custom images are usually images where a customer has a number of either a security stack, agents sitting there. It tends to be very heavy on the security side, the management side. It could be line of business applications that are just kind of a little bit different, and they want to preload those. Those would not be handled through our catalog system. They would be handled off board, and those would be stored in your Azure storage. So like Azure Blob Storage has the ability to maintain that. And so again, given the fact that we're talking about Windows 365 for government, that's both GCC and GCC High. If you had those offboard images, those custom install images, they would be stored in a Microsoft Azure Government blob storage account. So just as a point of clarification there, again, these are install images. So I just want to make really sure folks are clear. Windows 365 only needs access to that when you're going to crank up, like, hey, I'm going to give Phil an 8-core, 32 gig, 256 gig, cloud PC, and it's going to be built off of image X over here that's super, customized or whatever. And that image is then accessed and built. And once it's built in Win 365, it kind of sits there. So just because you update the image, understand you're not updating the cloud PC. The cloud PC uses it once. It looks at it and it really kind of forgets it. It's really like, I'm not really going to care about that install image anymore. So just because you pull a new version of install image, you update your gold image or whatever, you're not really updating any of the VMs. So just number one, want to be very clear about that as well. Those again reside. Now you can actually have Intune set up. This is where I'm going to install from. So when you mention Intune, It's not stored in Intune, but I don't think it really matters to the folks who are asking. It's actually stored in an Azure Government. So your image, if it were to hold any kind of identifiable information or secret keys or whatever you want to think about, that would all be stored also in a very protected environment, such as
Phil,
you could actually do it off board if you want to. You could completely do it on prem if you need to, but a lot of people and that might be. I've not had a lot of customers ask for on-prem custom image storage, but it's possible. You just go back through to however you'd express route back to whatever on-prem location you would need to.
Well, Phil, and I think you bring up a good point, and this kind of alludes to it, as with Windows 365, sometimes I've heard people say, you don't even need Azure with it. But there are some typical scenarios where you need at least a little bit of Azure. And one of those is that custom image, right? You need Azure storage for that. The other place where I see typically you need some Azure with Windows 365 is if you're going to AD join or hybrid join the VMs, because ultimately you need line of sight to a DC that's probably going to be in Azure. Right. And more importantly, you're going to need connectivity to back on premises to replicate that AD replication. So generally that's going to be an express route. So GCC customers, if they're going to be using a custom image, or they're going to be AD joined, or they need to get back to on-premises resources, they're going to need some express route, and that's going to all be in Azure Gov. So you need some Azure Gov, which is a good distinction. If you're GCC high, you probably already affinitized towards Azure Gov anyway, so it's not a big deal. But I've seen some issues where some customers are very committed to the Azure Commercial, Azure Public Cloud, and Windows 365 was a little more complicated just because of some of the requirements they had for Azure Gov because of the imaging or networking or AD join.
And we do have a commercial offering for Windows 365. However, right, the Windows 365 government offering comes with all of the compliance and certification requirements that most of our customers need.
And that's why, for example, for GCC, it is hosted in Microsoft Azure Government. And the reasoning behind that is because, to Nader's point, the commercial service doesn't have the guarantee of U.S. persons for ops and management and maintenance and that sort of thing. And Microsoft Azure Government real estate, you're not really technically, you're not talking to GCCI customers if you're GCC, but what you've got is you've got the real estate and the data center that's protecting you with things like physical security, U.S. persons, and the like. One other thing, I think John kind of alluded to this, if you're GCC and you do CAC PIV on-prem, you're going to need to somehow get back as well. So Azure networking, Azure capabilities are always going to be something that's kind of a pre-planned event. And I keep using that word pre-planned because I want folks to understand that that turning on Windows 365 and enabling it is extremely simple. It's simple when it's pre-planned properly, and we don't want customers to get and say, "Okay, well, just give me 300 of those CPCs, cloud PCs, and I'll just flip them on." And all of a sudden, they're going, "Well, I can't do. Wait a minute, how do I do this? And what does this look like?" So we just want to make sure that we're kind of going in with eyes wide open to understand. If you're a GCC customer, having a Microsoft Azure Government Azure subscription, which some have, a lot have, but just making sure that you do have that, so that you can do off-board storage of installation images, whether you do that in Azure Blob storage in government, or if you have to come back to on-prem file server, if you want to do that.
So just, a lot of my customers in the civilian space are GCC. So it's the understanding that there could potentially be the additional Azure for Government subscription, right? Because a lot of them don't necessarily purchase Azure in the government side. They have a commercial Azure subscription, which works well for them. So sometimes there's the addition of that subscription. And the thing is in Zero Trust, because part of our journey in this is ensuring that we really hit that second pillar of Zero Trust, which is the devices. When we start to have these conversations in pre-planning, I always talk about things like, your certificates and potentially migrating to the use of certificate-based authentication directly against Azure, right? So those are features that are available up through the DoD clouds now that our customers could take advantage of to help reduce their need for those on-prem connections.
And another point about custom images, one of the things Microsoft is also getting, is trying to help our customers implement, is the ability to do modern management, modern device management, modern application management. I worked in data center services for 15 years, and I know how doing gold images are, and I knew how much of a pain that is, and doing everything from driver installations, all kinds of things that you have to kind of worry through and plan for. And I have DISM nightmares as it is today. But I also want folks to understand that, part of the Intune ability around Windows 365 is that you have the ability to say, I'd like for these certain custom images to actually be piecemealed together. I want to take a standard Windows 11 image, let's say, put it in there with some optimizations, and then have Intune also be able to say, well, you probably need X, Y, and Z things as well, because you're in a group that needs a finance LOB app, or you need some sort of customized agent for systems monitoring, or you name it. And actually have Intune application management be able to kind of blow those down to those individual devices. Remember this, a cloud PC is a PC in the cloud. I know that's confusing, but once we deploy a Windows 365 device, that virtual machine is up to the customer to kind of maintain it. So virus definitions, driver updates, what you name it. And realistically, that cloud PC really only differs from a laptop, let's say, whatever, just by the manufacturing code. You look at it, and instead of looking like an X, Y, or Z OEM, it says it's a Microsoft. So you're still going to have that capability. So you think about the normal tools that you would manage a laptop, and I'm just picking on laptops. You can also use with the Intune service as well. So and I'm not trying to say people need to divorce themselves from custom images. I do think, however, it's becoming a bigger management burden to maintain custom images than it probably needs to be. And at some point in time, you'd have to make it like a management decision, a SOC decision. Hey, let's go this direction and start looking at that. It's not all or nothing. It's just kind of a migration point over to.
Phil, you bring up a good point, because there's a lot of organizations that they've got some heritage tooling when it comes to setting up their devices, right?
Yeah.
Not every, a very Microsoft centric view would be Intune. Intune's great.
Yeah.
Everybody should use Intune. But there's a lot of investment in the federal government in things like group policy.
Exactly.
Right? And whatever those are, right? And whatever DISA is, and their SNIGing and all that, right? And a lot of tooling for SCCM. Yeah. And so that's where we see with Windows 365, either you need that express route, and you need some connectivity, and you need some of that stuff, or maybe if you're not pivoting into Intune as quickly as some people are on the commercial side, maybe you stick in AVD, right? Because you don't pick up that Intune. So that there's a lot of consideration around an organization's ability to consume and leverage Intune. If you want to go cloud native and cloud first, Windows 365 makes it pretty easy. But if you're not there yet,
right,
that you may need to tap the brakes a little in some of this too, whether it's image management or management in general.
Yeah, that's one of the great reasons why we have to listen to the customer to say, hey, where are you at in your journey? Yeah. And if you're not there yet, it's not a ding. It's just, okay, let's start with a different approach. And then maybe even add Windows 365 for certain situations where you don't have this legacy thing that you may be dealing with.
And we have teams full of, we have teams full of people like Roy that will literally take you down that entire journey of getting off of your heritage solutions and adopting modern management.
I like that word heritage. It doesn't sound yes, I love it. Your old stuff, your old junk.
Every single day with our customers, I'm having those conversations. Hey, convert your GPOs to CSPs, right? If the setting doesn't exist, OMA, URI, custom settings. I mean, there are ways to modernly manage your devices that exist in the cloud today. And, it's the biggest thing for us, the biggest charge for us as cloud endpoint technical specialists is ensuring that our customers' data is protected through the zero trust model, right? That's really where we want our customers to live.
Yeah, and so I think, so selfishly, I see the next question that came in, so I want to tie it all together. I forget if John, you had mentioned it, but in terms of management, again, for these custom images, if you're building those, you generate that through, somehow it's in Azure, and then there is an extra step in Windows 365. If you want to use the custom image, you do upload it to Windows 365, upload or import from your Azure subscription, which does lead to our next question. I want to make sure if they asked, I want to get their name. Okay, just a question. Is there a limit to the number of images you can upload to Windows 365? So I think, yeah, Nyla, can you take this? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a soft limit of 20. And the soft limit, you can put in a ticket and get that increase. But the idea for the Windows 365 service is that you will use, like Phil said, you'll use modern management, right? You'll use Intune to deliver apps as opposed to carrying around all of these different bulky, golden images for each department that you're having, right? And we can increase it from 20, but today there is a soft limit of 20. But the idea is that we move away from golden bulky images, speed up provisioning time, deliver the apps via Intune.
I think it's important to mention that you can also use Intune for the multi-session images available with AVD to push images the same way.
Yeah.
And Azure Virtual Desktop doesn't have custom image limits, beyond what's in your blob storage, right? So,
there's no limit to AVD.
Yeah, and just a caveat, the more custom images you store, whether they be AVD or Win365, that's just blob storage that you're paying for. So just full disclosure, if you want to put 600 images up there, just understand for install purposes, when they're access to install on a VM or a cloud PC, you might be paying a lot of money. Just so that everyone is clear, you probably don't want to keep hundreds of images.
Yeah. Why would it? I mean, I've never seen a customer with more than a couple. Yeah, right. It would be
I had a 4 one time, and that was it. And that was a DoD facility. So that was.
Yeah. The other thing to talk about in the gallery images is the fact that with the built-in M365 apps, we take care of all of the Teams optimization and the M365 apps optimization in the image. So if you elect to go with your configurations for your enterprise coming from Intune through those CSPs and configuration settings, Office and its optimization is already handled with the Windows 365 image.
And that extends right to Teams and the operating system.
Things like OneDrive.
Right, we optimize. Yep, and one. Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the images that we have are optimized to run in the cloud, and typically we see the images that customers have are optimized to run on physical machines. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there, and we try to get customers just to start with our gallery images that are optimized, and then layer on via local manual install or Intune or SCCM, GPO, however you want to apply your apps, do it that way. We even see
it's
third party.
It's the same for AVD too, which is funny because, and it's even worse for AVD because with the preponderance of multi-session VMs, inevitably we get customers saying, can we bring our on-prem image and bring it into AVD? And like, you totally can. Well, we want to do that for a multi-session. Well, you can't because it's a different version of Windows, right? So you have to customize it in Azure, whether you're using Intune to layer or SCCM packages and advertisements or adding it in, sys-prepping it and capturing it, right? Which is what I end up doing most of the time.
I have seen customers use AVD images for their Windows 365 VMs. There's just a couple steps you need to go through to make sure it can't be a multi-session image, obviously. You need to remove the agent and clean it up so that it can be deployed in Windows 365.
Yeah, and I really do want to plus one what Steve mentioned. As we were just talking about, the multi-session image is really for AVD for that pooled scenario. And I know the larger engineering team has put a lot of resources to make sure it runs really well and it feels just like the regular Windows experience, Windows 10, 11 enterprise experience. But yeah, there's also a lot of work to make sure that you could also manage it and push things through Intune. So I just want to plus one that if you still are heavily in the AVD world, but you do push apps through Intune, then you can still do that with multi-session. Are there any other things that you want to touch on the image front before we move over to the next questions? It was a good discussion. I loved all the intricacies because it's all in the details. I feel like. Okay, so the one question we have is we have extremely complex networking and firewall rules in AVD to segregate and segment PCI, PII data, etc. We very granularly control and configure that access. Will Windows 365 have the equivalent control, or is AVD the better solution for this use case?
So we should probably talk about the architecture of Windows 365, right? And in every model, the virtual machine and disk for that virtual machine is hosted in a Microsoft subscription, right? And that subscription is going to be in Azure Government. That host can also host the network interface card of that virtual machine as well. So we would not only in a all Microsoft hosted architecture, not only host the virtual machine and disk, but also the virtual network resource group subscription, obviously. Yeah. There's a couple other options as well. We can inject that network interface card into a virtual network subnet of your choosing. That subscription has to live in Azure Government because of how the service is architected, right? So in that method, you can still join to Azure Active Directory and not leverage on-prem domain controllers, or based on your security policies, you can join to your on-premise domain controllers and just inject that network interface card into an existing network that you've got all your rules applied to.
So basically, you can do the same networking with AVD or Windows 365. You're just going to do it in Azure is the short answer there, right? So it's going to be exactly. You want to put some Palo Altos in or do some other crazy stuff? Yeah, we could do that in Azure. And Windows 365 works with that, or AVD.
So it won't be a decision of networking that will make your decision there. It's going to be the persona alignment conversation for the person who asked that question.
Perfect. And then also, so for the the person who did ask the question, feel free to post back again responding back, and if there's any other specific scenario, like a more specific scenario that we can help out with. But otherwise, we can always follow up, right now or afterwards, especially on our tech community page, which is the Windows 365 tech community. With the link right there. Perfect. And then while you follow up, while you ask other questions there for offline, we do have another question that came in from Kevin. Do Windows 365 VMs leverage any GPU for better performance of UC apps? I think it's Unified Communications apps, like Teams and Zoom. So are GPUs leveraged in Windows 365?
So that's a really good question. I think probably the easiest answer is not right now. So for example, from a GPU usage perspective, I think we've touched on it tangentially before. So if there are higher end GPU usage, and we often see high end GPU usage with things like artificial intelligence and developers and a number of other things, it's sophisticated modeling like, day 0 to day 50, situations with, CDC or NIH or some of those things where there's some very sophisticated modeling and a GPU is used specifically, as ancillary processing as well. AVD is a great solution for that. AVD's got a great track record, got huge use cases for that. From a Windows 365 perspective, as we mentioned before, this goes back to that persona, and I love the fact that Naller keeps kind of mentioning that it's really kind of a persona thing. So if you're looking for something and you believe, and again, I want to clarify one more thing, and you believe that GPUs are needed, I think we need to have a discussion. If you think GPUs are needed for Teams and Zoom, that's kind of a different story. As we mentioned before, we actually have the image that could be loaded. For example, I'm running a Windows 365 machine with an M365 image with Teams optimization. So there's a number of things we do. And so from an optimization perspective, think of it as like optimizing a VDI for real-time communications, voice, especially video. That's actually already kind of built into that cataloged image. So that's one good thing about using that. You're inheriting a lot of settings, a lot of reconfigurations, things that have been set up that we know operate. But so I wanted to kind of clarify that, number one, Windows 365 does not yet have a GPU option. That's kind of a future deliverable. But Teams and Zoom don't necessarily require anything more than we already can probably provide you. I would say memory and CPUs probably a better choice than just GPUs. So.
Yeah, I would submit that this is actually the perfect example of an AVD and Windows 365 scenario. So imagine a situation where you publish Windows 365 desktops to the majority of your workforce, and then only a fraction of them need GPUs either every day or once a month. Those Azure GPU VMs are pretty expensive to run when you're talking about the consumption-based model. So I've seen customers, they publish the GPU focused application, whether it's Esri or something else,
right,
as a published application, and you can make that available within the Windows 365 desktop.
Yeah, and I'll say I haven't seen a lot of need for GPU with Teams or Zoom or any of those other things. There hasn't been that benefit. I think the D series VMs that most people deploy on for AVD and leveraged by Windows 365 have a lot of oomph and it works great. But those Esri workloads, for example, ArcGIS Pro, man, do they love GPU. And I'll say in particular with AVD, you can deploy multi-session with a GPU. And this is where customers get a huge savings, right? They can deploy something like Esri or AutoCAD or some of these things on multi-session VMs, share a GPU amongst users where otherwise they would have dedicated a $6,000 or $12,000 workstation on-prem to them, and shut it down on the weekends if they want to. Maybe they don't get back on Monday if somebody grabbed it, but they could do that. But the economic benefit for those high-end workloads for GPU using multi-session have very often led those customers to really investigate AVD for that. And we've got a lot of federal customers using that.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, John, that also just mentally, it still goes back to that fish tank model. I won't be able to dissociate that from you, John.
I'll send you that slide because it's a classic. So.
It's a great slide.
I would love to see that.
GPUs are like a special colored light over top of the aquarium. It lights up the whole aquarium.
Oh boy. Okay. Let's see if we have more questions. We have 7 minutes left. I don't really see any more questions right now, but I do want to kind of go back to another topic we've been mentioning on and off. Steve, you just mentioned kind of using both AVD Windows 365 in terms of the workloads, the GPU. I want to go back because we've been talking about how Windows 365 is a seat-based, per user per month license, and AVD is more consumption. On the commercial side, I've noticed that there are some customers that will buy the number of Windows 365 seats for their standard workforce, and then either go with some more modern licensing or AVD for those vendors, the more flexible type, the seasonal ones. How does that relate to government? Since you all are the experts here and I know nothing about that.
Well, I mean, it's a very similar scenario. So we've got organizations where federal agencies that borrow employees from other federal agencies when there are disasters, let's say, during the off season, not to name any agencies, and they need to drastically scale up for brief periods of time to support call center applications and those sorts of things. And that's exactly where AVD comes in as a very useful scenario. They can have essentially deploy VDI dial tone in Azure with AVD, shut it all down, and when there's an issue, just pull the tarp off and heat it up, and they've got compute for 1,000 call center employees suddenly. And that's a great scenario, and they're not, and that's where AVD can scale up very thoughtfully. When you think about, for example, maybe the DoD, right, where they have a lot of reservists who might not be accessing services, but maybe one day a month, right? They don't need a lot of compute, but in the event that they're called up, instantly that needs to be expanded drastically. And so those are scenarios where AVD can make a lot of sense, because again, you're paying for the drink, right? You're paying for the electricity. So don't turn it on until you need it. But maybe you do need a trickle charger there for the infrastructure. Like, build the infrastructure out, just don't heat it all up until you need it, right? Like, it's getting towards lunchtime, so it's more like, creating lasagnas and putting them in the freezer and then pulling them out and heating them up when you need them. So,
and right, it's for Windows 365. It's the same, right? It's that conversation around, do I go in the modern licensing agreement, or for my flexible workforce, or do I go AVD? And cost is right. You don't want to pay for a year for something you're only going to use for a couple of months, right? Cost comes into play there, but also persona for your admins and for procurement and for your end users. Like, I just want to drill that in, is understanding what they're going to access, when they're going to access it, what experience they expect when they do access those things, and the responsibility from pricing and infrastructure management. Right. And we see lots of customers driving down their costs with AVD for those groups of users, those to go into Windows 365, because they've got those skills in house. Windows 365 is an easy turnkey solution if you don't have those skills in house.
Well, and not only, you bring up a great point. Like a lot of times we'll get into AVD conversations with customers, and they'll say, well, and they want to talk about auto scaling and shutting stuff down when people aren't using things, and they're trying to aggressively kick people off VMs. And then all of a sudden, they start talking about developers and data scientists who you can't terminate their session because they're compiling or doing something. Those are the people that Windows 365 ends up being a big cost benefit for. Firing up a 4-core, 8-core VM for a data scientist who you're not going to shut down, a lot better than buying a 730-hour VM in Azure for them. Plus, it's going to be administered in a thoughtful way. They can snapshot it. They can recover the VM if they might have done something bad to it.
Level 0 troubleshooting.
Self-healing, self-recovery. And that takes the administrative burden off the AVD folks for those kind of edge scenarios like that. For general purpose, everybody in the Navy, everybody in the Army, everybody across an agency where they're getting into an app or two and you can share it, AVD might be a more economic way to go. But data scientists, developers, sometimes Windows 365 can make a lot more sense.
And in my discovery with customers, it's my job to be a good fiduciary of their money, right? Like, it's my responsibility to make sure that they're going to get the best bang for their buck. And there's always a plethora of questions in discovering those personas and those use cases, right? And concurrency is definitely one of those. And by concurrency, I mean time of use on the actual VM. How long are you using that VM during a day? If it's a few hours, I'm more than happy. AVD may be the route to go. Right. But if, just like you said, if I'm compiling code or doing these other things, Windows 365.
Yeah. And so, okay, I think we have 2 minutes left. So I want to do quick 10 seconds, final thoughts. John, Nyler, Phil, Roy, Steve, 10 seconds, final thoughts.
Personas.
Fish tank.
I say, and Roy just brought up concurrency. We could talk an hour about concurrency, right? I mean, what that actually means and what people's perception of the compute is. Oh my God, we could spend all sorts.
We didn't talk about the one topic I usually hear: feature parity. So I often get asked, when is this feature going to be in Gov? The short answer is, for AVD, we want it within 30 days. But if you see something missing, talk to the people that you see here today, or reach out to me directly. And that part of my job is helping solve that issue, and it'll be a focus for the next 12 months for the team.
Yeah. So everyone stay connected with us on Tech Community. I know there's different government channels, so stay connected with us there. Thank you all for a fantastic discussion. For the audience, we'll see you next month, March 15th, for our next Windows 365 AMA. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.